Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggersfar Saga and the Spoken Books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 9. The libraries of erstwhile tend to keep to themselves. Aside from political gatherings and the occasional gala, they prefer to remain snugged in their own tiny spheres of influence. But the Acktus Trials attract interest from all the libraries. If the spoken book found by the victor is powerful enough, Illits might forego paying for services from their local library in favor of seeking out the city's new power. It wasn't unheard of for entire households to move to the victor's locality, leaving their prior library with fewer customers for speakings. That had happened several years ago, when Xavier Library had won the trials and brought back a spoken book capable of growing potato plants that produced 7 or 8 harvests in a single year. What's more, they thrived in a space small enough that Illits could have their own gardens, rather than going to the markets for food. Xavier was now the most powerful library in erstwhile next to Xavier, and several libraries had suffered as a result. The Acktus Trials mattered. At least, they mattered to the readers. To Baz, they were just another threat to his continued breathing. They arrived at the plaza, just inside the city's main gates. The wall around erstwhile was 50 feet tall and wide enough for 8 men to walk shoulder to shoulder across the ramparts. It was made of dark stone that matched the city's dreary weather. The main gate's portcullis was only halfway up, but there was more than enough room for even mounted men to ride through the opening with height to spare. There was a smaller enclosure beyond that led to another, smaller gate. This design meant that if invaders ever breached the front gate, they'd have to get through another and weather the killing ground in between as they tried to do so. Baz dismounted and stumbled, the insides of his legs already sore. Occasionally, when the weather was particularly bad, Deliritous permitted him to ride when he was out on errands. He knew the basics, but only just, and he'd never done more than an hour's riding around town. He hadn't even considered the hardship that riding for hours, days, weeks at a time would be, and it was only adding to the misery that had been slowly building in him since he'd ridden away from Torchsire Library. He wrapped Liana's cloak tightly about him, wishing they were already out of the city so there'd be no one around, other than Deliritous, to object to his putting the hood up. A conservator dressed in a white habit, marking him as a journeyer restorer who worked at the conservatory rather than at a particular library, bustled Deliritous, Baz, and Rox over to stand before a platform upon which the 9 representatives of the Table of Enya sat. Duke Octavinal had already assumed his seat amongst them, and Deliritous raised a hand toward him. One side of the Duke's mouth twitched upward, but he otherwise didn't acknowledge Deliritous. It might have been a smile, but more likely it was a restrained scowl at his son's outward show of excitement. Deliritous seemed to arrive at a similar conclusion and slowly lowered his arm, eyes falling with it. The conservator had placed them to the right of 2 other trios, their fellow competitors in this year's trials. To their immediate left was Hellar Xavier in a crimson tunic that had actual buttons all the way up its front. Baz mused that such a luxury was likely even more expensive than the clothes Duke Octavinal favored. Helar's dark hair was brushed to one side, and his portable lectern was folded and slung over one shoulder. His belt had a large space at the small of his back that held a single spoken book. He had no other weapons visible on his person. Overall, he looked the part of the heir of erstwhile's most powerful library. Helar was flanked by his Harbour on one side and Speaker on the other. The Harbour was arrayed just as Rox was, gray clothing, waxed leather breastplate, and leather mask. Unlike Rox, however, he was only an above-average hill rather than a towering mountain. All lean muscle, sinews, and tendons stood out beneath his skin. He had the standard-issue razor, of course. All Harbours did. But he also wore a bandolier stuffed full of knives across his chest and an unstrung war bow in the hand that wasn't holding the razor, which seemed fitting, as the Harbour's name was Arrow. On his back, Arrow wore a book pack, essentially a traveling bookshelf on shoulder straps. It had a transparent back that opened to the side to access the spoken books within. Trunnel, the speaker Helar had been using during the questioning of the Cityless, was to Helar's other side, a bold selection. Influencers were disturbingly powerful in certain situations, what with their ability to put thoughts into others' heads and words into their mouths. But out in the wilds, it seemed to Baz that a destroyer to kill things or a creator to heal would be more practical. Then again, Helar was universally acknowledged as a reader of incredible talent, so who was Baz to judge? Trunnel gave Baz a small nod. Baz returned the gesture with a grin full of teeth and no warmth. Trunnel rolled his eyes and looked away. Looking beyond Helar, Marla Kolnar stood with her Harbour and Speaker. They couldn't have looked any more different than Helar's group. Marla had the sort of face that perpetually seemed stuck somewhere between a snarl and a sneer, as if she'd spent her whole life giving orders and snapping at others. That was odd, considering she was only a niece to the Duchess of Kolnar, and not even a first child at that. The Duchess actually had a firstborn daughter who was of age to participate in the trials, but you only got one shot at them, so it seemed the Duchess had hedged this year, permitting a lesser member of her library to compete instead, rather than put the library's top candidate up against Helar. If Marla won, the Duchess would appear brilliant. If she lost, well, Marla could be written off as a minor reader with little promise. Marla was dressed in pants so tight they made Baz uncomfortable just looking at them. Her gray top was fringed in blue, the charging stallion of Kolnar Library stitched in repetition around the garment's hem. It was cut low enough to entice any man, but Baz was no fool and kept his eyes from her chest as if it were a page of a spoken book. She wore a rapier like Deliritus's at one hip and a parrying dagger at the other. Her Harbour wasn't much larger than an average-sized reader. Marla's Harbour was also a she, another oddity in the male-dominated line of work. Ryle was her name. She had intense brown eyes that had an unsettling blood-red tinge to them, particularly when they looked at you from over her Harbour's face mask. She wore a book pack like Helar's Harbour and had not one but two razors, each extended to their full lengths, large blades nearly scraping the ground as her arms hung casually at her sides. "You better look out for that one, Rox," Baz muttered. Truth," Rox rumbled. "I know, Ryle. Words mean odd things to her." Baz had never heard Rox hesitate like that before, which unsettled him more than it had any right to. Trying to put the Harbours out of his mind, he instead considered Marla's speaker, though that did nothing to settle Baz's ill ease. He was a creator, though it seemed too kind a label. His head was shaved and branded, a close-cut goatee clinging to his chin. His eyes were covered by at what first glance appeared to be solar spectacles, but only the wealthy, in other words, readers, wore those. No, those would be blinders. Some readers didn't go so far as Duke Octavinal and remove their speaker's eyes, but many did insist they use their sight as little as possible. Less seeing, less chance they could learn to read. It was said that denying one's body the use of a sense it hadn't lost did strange things to a man, and Baz could see it in Marla's speaker. He swayed in place with a sort of nervy anticipation, as if he'd lash out at the slightest stimulation. He licked his lips incessantly, as if he couldn't keep them moistened, and his hands kept opening and closing into fists. He reminded Baz of a mute, a ravenous dog, just waiting for the collar to come off. Most people thought of creators as healers and food producers, but Baz knew better. There were some truly awful spells a creator could utter that would kill you just as dead as any fireball conjured by a destroyer. The conservator who'd moved them into place was now on the platform, standing behind a lectern. Arrayed before the platform, behind the trio of competitors, were congregations from each of the 9 libraries, and beyond them a crowd of illits who had also gathered to listen to the opening ceremony. "My fellow citizens of erstwhile," said the conservator, raising his arms to draw attention, "welcome to the start of the 249th Acktus Trials." Applause and a few cheers came from the crowd. "As we prepare to send our fine competitors off on this year's trials, it is important for us all to remember how we got here. Society was not always so well ordered and peaceful as it is now. Before the burning, anyone was permitted to read, regardless of qualification. Theft, murder, war, all were rampant. The land may have been called the United Cities of Oration at the time, but in truth they fought amongst each other as much as they stood together. There was no true order, no hand to guide the citizens of Oration." Baz rolled his eyes. It didn't seem to him that the cities of the Triumvirate were any more united now. They kept to themselves, except when trade forced them together. Then came the summit, called by the 3 great scribes, Liamina Fortune, Helfax Erstwhile, and the Enigma, Pront v. Lexdor, gods given flesh to guide us. They'd a vision for Oration, a consolidation of power and knowledge with only those worthy to possess it, those with responsibility, with true ability, and with the foresight to see action's consequences. So they proposed a gathering of Oration's strongest orators. The conservator was interrupted by a general grumbling from the crowd. Orator. Before the burning, it had been used to describe one who was particularly good at both reading and speaking. Now you were deemed a dreaded cuss if you demonstrated such capacity. The conservator held up his hands, imploring the crowd to silence. "Please, it is only a history. No need to take offense." There were a few continued grumbles from the crowd, but they quieted enough for the conservator to continue. So the orators gathered, intending to write 3 new spoken books in a language that could be understood only by those select few. They gathered at Tome, locking themselves in the room at the peak of the great library's tallest tower. They had nearly completed their work, but then something went terribly wrong. There was an explosion. The top of the great library simply there one moment, gone the next. Much of the rest of it burned in the aftermath, the skies turning red as blood. To this day, none know what happened, save that all 3 of the great scribes and most of Oration's orators were lost in the blink of an eye. And the destruction didn't end there. Fire rained from the skies throughout erstwhile, destroying buildings and killing thousands. So began the uncertainties, the years following the burning. With the leaders of Oration's cities gone, they became lawless dens of evil. The remains of our once great capital of Tome were looted repeatedly, until its remaining shelves were all but bare, and what portions of it that hadn't been destroyed by the burning were left in ruin. Then a beacon of hope shone upon Oration, a native of our very own city, Acktus Deliritous Torchsire. The conservator inclined his head respectively toward Duke Octavinal, who returned the gesture before the conservator continued. Acktus Torchsire led the second burning, confiscating or destroying spoken books that had fallen into unfit hands, until the power of the books resided solely in the 9 libraries of erstwhile, the 7 libraries of fortune, and the 3 libraries of enigma. He established the system of order we still follow today. Those with great proclivity for words are our readers. Those bound to the words become our speakers, separating power to ensure dependence upon one another rather than division. Baz suppressed a snigger with only partial success, drawing a glare not only from Deliritous, but from Hellar Xavier beside them. Baz stared straight ahead, pretending he hadn't done a thing, and the readers eventually turned away from him. But seriously, though? Did they actually believe what this conservator was preaching? Power was not separated. The speakers held none of it. He could just imagine how Tax would react to the conservator's speech. And of course, our illiterates, who eschew the power of the written word altogether to support our society. Oration rests on the foundation you provide. The conservator's words were followed by what Baz thought was a rather half-hearted smattering of applause from the illits who had gathered to watch the ceremony. But, the conservator said after the applause had died away, order came at a price, for with the separation of power that saved oration came the reality that no longer could any of the bound be taught to write, and thus new spoken books could not be created. So with each passing year, the great power of the triumvirate fades. The conservators do what they can to restore the spoken books, but time is only an opponent you delay, not defeat. So we started the Acktus Trials. Each year we send brave young men and women out into the wilds, chancing the perilous path to the ruins of Tome, in search of the few spoken books that remain there. As we know, some of the scribes' old spells still hold over the ruins, and books don't age the same there as they do outside the ruins. This year, we send 3 competitors to the once great library: Hellar Xavier, Marla Kolnar, and Deliritous Torchsire. There was polite applause after Marla's and Deliritous' names, though it was mostly drowned out by those who were still roaring for Helar after his name was announced first. The glower on Deliritous' face brought a smile to Baz's. These 3, the conservator continued, will face grave danger, but they do it for the good of erstwhile. The conservators wish you the scribe's blessing. He made the gesture of the Trinity, hands cupped together like a book, then raising 3 fingers to his lips. Baz wondered if he and the other speakers were included in the scribe's blessing. He doubted it. Now, I present to you a very proud Duke Xavier to go over the rules of this year's competition. Duke Xavier rose from his seat at the center of the 9 members of the table and approached the lectern, stopping briefly to shake hands with the conservator who'd been speaking. He had the same dark hair as Helar and the same pale eyes. Baz found somewhere else to look. The rules are simple, Duke Xavier said in a powerful voice. You depart together and must return within 60 days. You are free to take whatever path to Tome you wish. The way through the Reach and across the Firelands and Weeping Plains is shorter, but more treacherous. The way through the Emerald Woods longer, but generally safer, though not without challenges. You may work together or go your separate ways. This is a competition, after all, and so long as no reader uses mortal force against another, you may compete as you wish. Baz sourly noted the conspicuous absence of any prohibition against the use of foul play on a reader's speaker. For that matter, there was quite a bit of pain one could inflict upon another without stooping to mortal force. It wasn't uncommon for readers to return from the trials maimed and missing their speaker or Harbour, or both. Baz eyed Helar and Marla, wishing he was back in the sub-basement with Tax, listening to the retirees' songs. Duke Xavier continued with the rules. Upon arriving at Tome, you may search wherever you wish in the ruins for spoken books, but by the terms of the Triumvirate Consolidation Treaty, you may only take 1 with you. Choose wisely, as you will be judged by the Table of Enya on the quality and usefulness of the volume you retrieve. The winner of the competition will be determined by a vote of the table at the end of the 60 days. Are there any questions? No one stirred. Baz considered raising his hand to ask whether it was too late for him to back out of this madness, but that would just throw him into an entirely different world of pain, one there was no chance of him escaping. At least with the trials, there was a possibility of him coming out alive. Though, after sneaking another glance at Hellar and Marla, and then looking back to Deliritous, Baz concluded the probability of his still breathing at the end of the next 60 days was even lower than he'd thought. Duke Xavier raised his arms above his head to take in all those assembled. Hearing no questions, by the power vested in me by erstwhile's governing body, I declare the Acktus Trials officially underway. May you have a swift journey, competitors. We will see you in 60 days. Deliritous eyed Hellar and Marla, who eyed him right back, no one wanting to make the first move. After nearly a minute of that, Baz shook his head and hoisted himself onto his mount. Not wanting to be outdone, Hellar's influencer did the same. Deliritous sighed, and Baz knew the Torchsire heir was glaring at him, though he didn't turn to look. Moments later, everyone was mounted and riding beneath erstwhile's main gate, each group staying as far from the other two as the gate's width would permit. Baz tried to tell himself the twisting in his stomach was just from the horse's movement over the uneven paving stones, but he suspected that the feeling of dread in his gut would be with him for quite some time. All right, everyone, welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is February 24th, 2022. As I record this, this is episode number 8 of the book club. Like I mentioned in the last episode, I'm recording a couple of episodes here back to back because I am taking a mini vacation to Chicago next week. So no real additional personal update than from episode 7. Still plugging away on my personal edits to the third part of the Spoken Books Uprising, Declaimer's Flight. A little more than halfway getting my handwritten edits entered into the computer. So that's that. Also the cover to Declaimer's Discovery, which is part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising, is complete, and we'll be revealing that officially on March 11th. So keep an eye out for that, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook, or join my mailing list if you want to be one of the first people to see the cover. Other than that, I think that's all I've got really for you. So why don't we just launch right into our analysis of Chapter 9, and then stay tuned because we're going to go over the quest answers for episodes 1 through 7 and announce our grand winner, our inaugural DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club quest champion. All right, so let's hop into Chapter 9, which are the opening ceremonies of the Acktus Trials. First we see this, it's kind of like a national holiday, right? The whole city gets together for this opening ceremony. Everyone from the Illits all the way up to the Table of Enia, which is the leaders of erstwhile. Though, it's sort of like a holiday, like the Hunger Games were a holiday in Pan Am, in those books. Not necessarily a celebration for everyone. Certainly the competitors are going into a dangerous situation. And we also see, libraries rise and fall based on the results of these trials, right? We hear this one story really quickly at the beginning of Chapter 9. One of the other libraries in erstwhile a few years back found this book that basically lets you magically grow potato crops basically in your house. And it sounds like a lot of people actually moved to, the neighborhood of that library so they could pay that library to read the book for them so they'd have their own crops. And that really hurt some of the other libraries because, they're all competing, as we can see, because, the Illits pay the readers to do readings and speakings for them. So, libraries have a lot vested in their competitors succeeding in bringing back a new, never-before-seen spoken book from the ruins of Tome. Though, of course, Baz as always throws in, well, maybe they're significant for the libraries, but not for me. They're just a threat to my continued breathing. The trials are. So, obviously, Baz doesn't have a rosy opinion of the trials, as we've already seen. Just a real quick note, we see the whole city of Erstwhile is built kind of like a fortress, right? These giant 50-foot walls that, 8 men can walk abreast on top of, and it's got this giant portcullis and the killing ground, right? So there's one big gate, but, that leads to another gate further out. So if someone wants to invade, they're really like trapped in this tiny courtyard before they can actually get into the city. So just kind of an interesting description for now, but that'll become more relevant in subsequent books. So just keep that in mind. Right, so before we get to the actual start of the opening ceremony, where we get some history and the rules of the competition, we get a little more detail about our competitors. Remember, it's Hellar Xavier and Marla Kolnar. They are the other 2 readers who are going on the trials, and we've met them already at the questioning of the Cityless back in chapters 3 and 4. I guess it was mostly chapter 4. But we do get to see the other 2/3 of the trio. They are each bringing with them Hellar's influencer, or Hellar's Harbour, pretty similar to Rock's, right? Though he is only a above average hill, right, rather than a towering mountain, says Baz. So, all these harbors are big, nasty guys, but Rock's is particularly large. So, Hellar's Harbour is not as big as Rock's. He's got the standard issue razor and also a bandolier, which is like the belt, but that it goes diagonally across to your chest. So a bandolier full of knives. And incidentally, I think I first came across the the term bandolier in what's the series called? Well, the Abhorsen series. That's not what the series is actually called, but those are the old something. Sorry, it's escaping me. But the Abhorsen series by Garth Nix, Sabriel is the first one. Great stories. Kind of the concept there is the main character is kind of like a reverse necromancer, so they send undead things back to death instead of raising the dead to be minions for them. So, and they have a bunch of bells. Bells are their weapons, and each of the bells does something different to undead monsters, and they carry them in a bandolier. So, sidetrack there, but a little bit of inspiration there. But we've got this Harbour, so he's got a bunch of knives and a bow. So he is decked out in weaponry. And he's also carrying a book pack. So like a backpack, right? But meant just for carrying books. Baz calls it a traveling bookshelf on shoulder straps, basically. So kind of picture a big, maybe like a camping backpack. But it's really just like a bookshelf with a clear, like a clear opening on the back so you can see all of the books in it. And you'll see all the readers have one of these because they got to carry their books around in something. And then we also see Hellar's speaker, or the speaker that Hellar is bringing with him, and it is Trunnel. This is the same influencer we saw earlier when Xavier when Hellar Xavier was reading during the questioning of the cityless, trying to get him to tell where he learned to read. And Baz notes this is an interesting choice, right? Because most either choose, a healer, which creators or healers, they can heal wounds or diseases, or a destroyer who can fling about offensive spells. Those are the two more likely choices to bring on the trials. So let's be honest here. Like, I wouldn't be pointing this out if there weren't going to be some interesting consequences to Helar choosing to bring an influencer with him down the road. So, what do we think Helar has planned with a speaker who's kind of capable of mind control? So it'll be interesting for all of you to see how that plays out here. But obviously, we are laying the groundwork for some future issues for our heroes here. Then we turn to Marla Kolnar. Remember, she is the young woman, I guess, who was really enjoying watching the cityless get tortured. Remember, she was kind of like petting the pommel of her knife at one point. So she is not a girl you want to mess with here. And we learned she probably has a bit of a chip on her shoulder too, right? As Baz points out to us that the Duchess of Kolnar, who again is the Duchess, it's a duke or a duchess. That's who is the leader of all of the libraries. So the most powerful person in her library, the most powerful person in Marla's library actually has a daughter who is also old enough to compete in the trials, but she's been held back this year so she doesn't have to go up against Helar, who is kind of considered like the overwhelming favorite here. It seems. So Marla's kind of like the sacrificial lamb here, unless she wins, in which case, Kolnar will look great by beating Xavier with a lesser candidate. But, we definitely remember how unsettling she was back in that scene with the cityless. So the fact that she has kind of extra motivation here to defeat the other two competitors, that certainly doesn't bode well either. We're laying some more groundwork here. Marla's Harbour is a woman, which Baz notes is odd, just because harbors are usually big burly men. And she has two razors, right? Not just one, but two of them. She's got both of them extended to their full lengths, kind of just hanging at her side. And she's, so she is kind of giving off a similar aspect of terror as her master here, right? Someone else you really don't want to mess with. And especially we see Rox's reaction, right? Baz mutters to Rox, "Oh, you better look out for that one." And Rox is like, truth. He says he knows Ryle, right? And words mean odd things to her. So it even seems, and Rox hesitates there, right? Words mean odd things to her. So Baz is kind of freaked out a little by the the hesitance in Rox's voice. If Rox, the big giant Harbour, is kind of concerned about Ryle, which is Marla's Harbour, geez, definitely grounds to be scared there. And then we see Marla's speaker, who is a creator. And let me just say, it wasn't really an accident that I chose one of each types of speakers to bring here. I wanted to make sure the readers got good exposure to each type. So Marla's got a creator, and he's kind of mad, right? He wears blinders, like kind of like the things that a horse wears. I guess they kind of look like sunglasses, but you can't actually see through them. So this is another tactic the readers use to make sure their speakers don't learn how to read. It's like, well, we're going to keep your eyes covered, whenever possible, so you can't be looking at stuff. But Baz questions whether that's really any better than than just ripping his eyes out. I think Baz's quote here is, "It was said that denying one's body the use of a sense it hadn't lost did strange things to a man." Now, I'll be honest, I haven't really researched this issue too much, but I can certainly see how it might drive someone a little bit crazy if, you can see, like you physically are capable of it, but you're never allowed to use your eyes. Regardless of how much truth that actually holds out here in the real world, it definitely applies to Marla's creator. I'm going to read this whole description of him just because I think it, really gives you the picture of how, how startling this guy is. He swayed in place with a sort of nervy anticipation, as if he'd lash out at the slightest stimulation. Geez, that rhymes. That's not intentional. Sorry about that. He licked his lips incessantly, as if he couldn't keep them moistened, and his hands kept opening and closing into fists. He reminded Baz of a mute, ravenous dog, just waiting for the collar to come off. Most people thought of creators as healers and food producers, but Baz knew better. There were some truly awful spells a creator could utter that would kill you just as dead as any fireball conjured by a destroyer. So again, obviously some description for description's sake here. I'm just, I want you to all have a good picture of, all of these other individuals who are going to be going off on the Acktus Trials with our trio of main characters here, Baz, Deliritous, and Rox. But also, obviously, I have thought through these selections, or I did think them through when I was writing this. So we're gonna see all of these folks come into play here very soon as we head out on the trials. But first, we get some history of Oration, and we really start tying some more things together. Some of the things we've kind of been putting together from the prologue by implication are really kind of just explicitly confirmed here. So the very first thing we hear, this conservator kind of gets up on the stage and starts giving a spiel about the history of Oration. This is the 249th Acktus Trials, so they have been going on for quite some time. So we know the burning happened like 3 centuries ago, and then it was like 2 decades or so before that second burning. So really, not too long after the second burning, they've been doing these Acktus Trials, every year. So what is about 30 years or so after the second burning, they must have started. Right. So, and remember, so before the burning, anyone could read, and allegedly theft, murder, and war were rampant. Right. That's what the conservator says. And then, very quickly here we see him, building up and giving the argument for why why society has been shaped into the current tier structure that it's in. So we see the 3 scribes called the Summit, right? And he calls them God's given flesh to guide us, which I think we kind of saw that implied earlier, that at least some people, definitely the conservators, treat these 3 scribes like gods, and probably with some good reason. At least they're the people who pretty much invented spoken books, so obviously they were very powerful individuals. And this conservator tells us their vision was to consolidate power and knowledge with only those worthy to possess it, right? Ones with responsibility, true ability, and foresight. And they called a gathering of Oration's strongest orators, which remember the crowd gets a little upset with that term, because I guess that's what I know because I wrote it, right? That was what cusses were called before the burning. So if you were really good at reading and speaking, you were an orator. So obviously we had a nice grand sounding title back then, and now it's moved to cuss, because we being the readers do not like people who know how to read and speak. So they get a nasty name for them now. And so apparently it was the 3 scribes' intent, by calling this summit, to write new books in a language that could only be understood by a select few. So they were trying to, at least according to this conservator, trying to shrink the universe of people who would be able to read books. So kind of kind of the direction society's already moved in, except here they were just trying to make the language so complicated that most people wouldn't be able to understand it, instead of just preventing all of the bound from learning to read. So they locked themselves in the peak of the Great Library's tallest tower. And remember, where did we see the Great Library's tower before, right? That was back in the prologue. And remember, the very first sentence of the prologue is, a spell had blown, the top of the library's tower off. In fact, I got my book right here. What does it actually say? Yes. The roof of the Great Library's tower was gone. This is the first sentence of the prologue. The roof of the Great Library's tower was gone, destroyed by a spell that had surely sowed centuries of turmoil across all of Oration. And then what does the conservator tell us here? Something went terribly wrong with the summit. They were almost done writing the books, and then there was an explosion, blowing the tower's top off and much of the rest of the library as well. So there you go. Kind of as much confirmation as you need, I think, that the prologue was showing us the burning here. And we learned that the skies turned red, and all the great scribes, along with many orators, were lost, and fire rained down from the skies throughout erstwhile. So this was a really kind of a big catastrophe here. You can see why people are afraid of it even 300 years later. And it kind of threw Oration into chaos, right? Because most of the most powerful people in Oration were all called to this summit, and they were all killed when this disaster occurred. So this time called the Uncertainties followed, because much of Oration's leadership, again, they died in the burning. And this was when Tome was looted and further ruined beyond just the destruction that occurred initially at the burning. The shelves were picked all but bare, the conservator tells us. And then a man named Acktus Deliritous Torchsire. So we kind of see where Deliritous gets his name, right? He's named after this very famous person from their library. He led the second burning to restore order. Remember, we heard about this already a few chapters ago. He confiscated books until their power resided solely in, and this is interesting, so we learn how many libraries there are in each of the three cities. And remember, we've seen the triumvirate referenced a few times, and that's because there's three main cities in the land of Oration. We have Erstwhile, which is where we currently are, and there are 9 libraries there. And then there's the city of Fortune, which is out on the ocean vast to the west of Erstwhile, and that has 7 libraries. And then Enigma, which is kind of up in the mountains. Remember, that's where Rox is from. He's from Enigma. They're the ones who like to twist and get creative with the interpretation of words. There are 3 libraries in Enigma. So there you go. And, this second burning confiscated or destroyed books. That's what Acktus Deliritous Torchsire did, and consolidated the power until no one but the libraries had any books. And he also established this separation of powers, right, between the readers, the speakers, and the illits. And the conservator giving the speech here says, this was done to ensure dependence on one another rather than division. Baz suppressed a snigger. They actually believe that? He can't believe what this guy is saying. Power hasn't been, divvied out between multiple groups. That's all in the hands of the readers. The speakers don't have any. So, he's a little incensed at that. But that's the story the upper tiers of society are telling themselves to justify the society that they have built here. Right, and then, again, we already kind of ferreted this out earlier, but this conservator also clarifies the trials were started because new books can't be made, and you have to go find more. Though, interesting, we learn that some of the scribes' old spells still hold sway in Tome, which means books don't age the same way there. So, just even more, more justification for why these trials have been going on for so long. Not only are there
books hidden there that, maybe hold powers that none of the current books the libraries own possess, but they don't age as quickly. So it's, the books there are going to be newer than anything else any of the libraries have, because, these books, they can be restored, right? But the conservator is like, well, time isn't a opponent you can beat, right? You can hold it back, but you can't beat it. So even with the restorers, eventually these books are just going to fall apart. So finding a book that, is in, like new condition is a big deal. So, and then, so the conservator ends his part of the speech. He gives everyone the scribe's blessing with the gesture of the Trinity, the hands cupped together like a book, and then raising 3 fingers to his lips. So kind of like the Oration's version of the sign of the cross, I guess, there. And then at the end of the chapter, we get an overview of the rules of the competition. Duke Xavier gets up to give them, so Hellar Xavier's father. So you got 60 days, so you got to travel out there and back, which seems like plenty of time, right? Baz noted in the last chapter, it takes about 2 weeks to travel out there and 2 weeks to travel back. So that gives you pretty much a whole month to search Tome. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but that's 2 weeks of just travel, not accounting for any trials or tribulations you may encounter along the way. But still, 60 days, that seems reasonable. And there are 2 main paths to Tome. One is a shorter one, but more dangerous. That one is through the Reach and across the Firelands and Weeping Plains. That one is shorter but more treacherous. And then there's one that's longer, but also safer, and that is the one through the Emerald Woods. I will throw the map up on the screen on YouTube so you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. You can also always head over to dtkane.com and click on the Resources tab to get a nice high-resolution photo of the map of Oration as well, so you can envision that a little bit better. But, we will be introduced to each of those locations: the Reach, the Firelands, the Weeping Plains, the Emerald Woods, as we move further into the book here. The competitors are permitted to work together or separate. There's no real rules about what you got to do other than you can't use mortal force against another reader. Though, again, Baz emphasizes, he emphasizes there's no rules against using mortal force on speakers, right, or harbors for that matter. And also the fact that, you can inflict quite a bit of pain without using, quote, mortal force. So the mortal force rule, it's very, really like a bare minimum here, right? Baz knows, readers come back maimed, maybe mortal force wasn't used, but, you can cut someone's arm off without using mortal force, I guess. So you can still, it's almost no holds barred, right? You can only take 1 book from Tome. We learned that there is the Triumvirate Consolidation Treaty, so I guess the cities have agreed that you can't just go and loot the library, which makes sense. Otherwise, how could you have had 249 of these competitions? And then when the competitors return, the winner is declared by the Table of Ennea, so they judge which book is the best one that is brought back. So, geez, you can go through all this, bring a book back, and still not win. So maybe some more motivation there for competitors to definitely hinder the other ones, because obviously, especially here with only 3 people, I guess if you can prevent the other 2 from even finding a book, then you win automatically, right? So there's definitely motivation here to mess with the other competitors. All right, so that's actually it for the analysis. Maybe a little quicker. I think that was a little quicker than some of our other weeks, which is good. I love chatting with all of you, but I think an hour and a half is probably too long for a lot of episodes, and the occasional hour and a half episode is good, but I'd love to keep these closer to an hour. Though if you really love the marathon episodes, let me know. Shoot me an email, dtkane@dtkane.com, and I'll make sure to at least keep including some of those longer form ones. Right, so homework assignments for next week. We'll be reading Chapter 10. Our competitors are finally off, and they are traveling through the wilds. Let's see. Deliritous makes a deal with his other competitors. Is he savvy or stupid? What do we think after he makes his deal? Baz also talks with Trunnel and receives a dire warning. What do we think that portends for what is to come here? And then Baz really puts his foot in his mouth. We've already seen him put his foot in his mouth a few times, but this one is particularly bad. But then he's rescued by an unlikely source. What do you think of that? So there are some things for you to look out for in Chapter 10. But as usual, remember, if you don't do your homework, that's okay, because I will be reading for you and answering those questions and many more next week. Let's see. We're not going to do a listener question this week because we're going to go over all the quest answers, which let's do that now. So I've got 7 questions here. Our question from episode 1 was, what do you think was my inspiration for the dragon we meet in the prologue? So the book dragon, the white one with the writing on his hide. Some people did get this. He looks a lot like Falkor from the Neverending Story, right? And yeah, there is definitely some inspiration. There. I've always one of the things when I was just brainstorming ideas, back before I even really got the idea for this series, was what are things people like to see in stories? And people love animals, right? Stories where the main character has an animal, familiar or companion go over well. So I definitely wanted to work something like that in. I know we haven't seen too much of our book dragon yet, but he is coming. He's going to be in the book later. And Falkor is just such an iconic kind of mushy kind of stuffed animal character, but at the same time, a really strong force in the never-ending story. So, yeah, he definitely some influence there for my book dragon character in the spoken books. Let's see, about how old is Baz in chapters 1 and 2? Again, I didn't come right out and say it, but you can kind of figure it out. So let's see. Let me just flip to chapter 1 here. Right. So in chapter 1, page 9, at the top of the page there, if you're in the physical book, we have this quick little story about why the speaking rooms are separated from the rest of the library, and that's because if a speaking goes wrong, you want it to be set apart from the rest of the library. We learned that the speaking room at Prashat Library was raised by a destruction spell gone awry 10 years ago, and shortly before Baz had been born. So, right. So shortly before Baz had been born. So 10 years ago was a little before Baz had been born. So what does that mean? So Baz is like 8 or 9, right? A little ambiguous. But yeah, so Baz was like 8 or 9, which means he is 18 or 19 or thereabouts in the main chunk of the book, because that happens 10 years later. So good job if you got that one. What is the statue of the dragon in the conservatory calling to mind from earlier? And I think this was a pretty easy one, but obviously that's a book dragon statue in the conservatory, and we saw a book dragon in chapter 1. So there's the connection there. And we know at this point that the prologue was and I might have just said chapter 1, but I meant that the book dragon was in the prologue. We know the prologue was the burning, and likely that Bront v. Lexdor was one of the 3 scribes, so the book dragons were friends of the scribes, and now the conservators use the book dragon as kind of this good luck symbol, or their their mascot, if you will. So I'm making some more connections there. Episode 4. I got some good ones for this. Send me your favorite excerpt from chapter 4. I figured I would just share mine here. This is towards the end, right before Baz decides to save Deliritous from the Sidious who is charging him with a knife. So, visions of his wildest dreams coming true flooded Baz's mind. Deliritous dead, just what the idiot deserved. Finally, payback for what he'd done to Tax. No one else in the room was making any move to help Deliritous either. The gathered readers would gladly watch one of their competitors struck down. Baz ought to have felt satisfaction at that, Deliritous falling victim to the same societal mores as had victimized his brother. But instead, Baz found a hollow emptiness in his gut. I like that for really what it shows about Baz as a character. I think that kind of really sums up Baz's character very nicely. He's got all this hate for Deliritous. In fact, we see when he's talking to Yeltax, subsequent to that chapter down in the sub-basement, how he has to hate Deliritous enough for both of them. He tells us, but despite that, he still can't let Deliritous just get killed when he has the power to do something about it. So we see Baz's internal conflict there, but ultimately, it seems he is a good guy, and deep down, even despite how much he tells us on the surface that he hates Deliritous. So I like that. There's several funny quips from Baz in chapter 4. I think I picked out most of those, though, when we did our discussion of chapter 4 back several episodes ago, so I figured I wouldn't go and repeat those. Let's see. What do you think the inciting incident of the novel is? I had this debate with myself a little back in the episode when we discussed this question, but I think the two ones are, well, is it Delilah getting hit in the throat by the Sidious and she can't speak anymore, or when Duke Octavinal announces that Deliritous is going to be taking Baz on the trials. And I think it's that latter one. Like I said, I think you can make arguments for both, but, we still don't, you can probably see it coming, but when Delilah gets hit and she can't talk right, we still don't really know for certain, or at least Baz does not know that he's going on the trials at that point, right? He hasn't realized that. So the inciting incident is usually what propels our protagonist into the rest of the story, and I think that is, when Duke Octavinal says, well, you're taking your destroyer with you, Deliritous. That's the only option you've got. And, coming from Duke Octavinal, that's pretty final, right? No one questions the Duke of the Library. So at that point, we and Baz kind of know with almost certainty Baz is going, and that's what the rest of the book is going to be about. And incidentally, I don't think it's... a couple folks maybe made an argument that it's later when... Yeltax fails to come up with any ideas for Baz to get out of the trials, but I don't think that's quite right. That's more of like the first plot point. So usually you have you got the kind of the background. That's usually how the book starts. You see what the ordinary world looks like, and then you have your inciting incident, and then you have the first plot point, which is where the character makes a decision in response to the inciting incident that launches them forward. And, that point is where, Baz finally resolves that he's going. When Yeltax says, really Tax encourages him to go. And Baz is like, well, I guess I'm going. So I would see that more as plot point 1. We mentioned the Hunger Games earlier. So there, the inciting incident is when Katniss's sister is chosen for the Hunger Games. So that's the inciting incident. And then plot point 1 is where Katniss decides to volunteer herself as tribute in Prim, right? Is it Prim? Primrose, right? Yeah. Prim's place. So there you go. Little story structure lesson there. Episode number 6, moving right along. What did I left out a connection between Tax's tattoo and something earlier in the book. Did you pick up on this? But where else have we seen spoken words written on another living thing? And that was going back again to our book dragon from the prologue, and also the statue in the conservatory has writing on it, as does Lyanna's miniature statue in her workshop. So that's interesting, right? We still haven't seen what the real significance of the writing on the book dragon is, but you got to think it's probably not a coincidence that Baz's brother now has this tattoo of words from one of the languages of the Trinity tattooed on him, and we have this kind of mythic book dragon creature who has something similar. So we'll definitely want to see how that progresses and what the significance of that is as we move forward in both the book and the larger series. And finally, favorite fantasy author was our question from the last episode. Keep sending me those. Haven't gotten a ton of answers to that question yet, but I am interested to hear what some of my listeners' favorite authors are. And like I said, you're not getting any extra experience points for listing D.T. Kane as your favorite author, so be honest out there. I gave you a few of mine last week. Someone actually asked me that question, which inspired me to ask it back to all of you. Another good one, I like Stephen R. Donaldson a lot. I don't think I mentioned him when I discussed that a few episodes back. He's most well known for his Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever series. There's 9 or 10 books, and that I've actually only read the first 3, but those are the original ones, and I really like those. The language in them borders a little on the literary sometimes, so if you don't like that kind of very fanciful prose, it might not be quite for you. But if you like really nice descriptions and prose, but also fantasy, might be right up your alley. I should just give a trigger warning here. There is a rape scene kind of early on in the first book, which is called Lord Fowl's Bane. So just that warning. So if that really turns you off, you may not want to get into that series. But if you can get past that, it really is excellent writing and a great story. Thomas Covenant is arguably, one of the first modern anti-heroes in fantasy. Dark fantasy and grim dark. That's very popular now, but not really so much back in the 70s when Donaldson started writing those books. So definitely recommend them with that one caveat. And actually, let me go up to my bookshelf here. This is actually, let me see, there we go. This is a first edition, first printing of Lord Fowl's Bane. Kind of one of the prides in my little book collection here, but I like the series enough to have acquired one of these. So there you go. It's in really good shape for a book that's 177, I think, right? 1977, yes. So, geez, we're going on 50 years. That's startling. So there you go. Those are the quests, and our winner, first ever D.T. Kane's Fantasy Book Club winner, was Diane from New York. So good job, Diane. Maybe I'll put in some dub over with a applause there. But Diane will be receiving a signed copy of the Acktus Trials by yours truly. So, Diane, I'll be in touch. Thanks for participating, and we'll start up a new series of quests next week. All right, so that's that, and we just got a quote here to close it up. And I figured, why not? I just mentioned Mr. Stephen R. Donaldson, so I figured I'd grab a quote from him. This is actually from The One Tree, which is actually a book of his I have not read yet, but will be at some point. But the quote is, "Freedom doesn't mean you get to choose what happens to you, but you do get to choose how you react to it." I like that. I think that's probably good advice for Baz here. Baz does have a bit of a woe-is-me attitude at times, and I think he needs to realize, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can choose how you react to it. And I think that's good life advice in general. I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy, and this is definitely a very Stoic attitude. You gotta accept what you can't control, and know what you can. And usually, often the only thing you can control is how you react to the events that happen to you. Remember, you always have control over how you react, and that can be kind of freeing if you really do embrace that. That kind of goes along with kind of a related philosophy to this, that no one except yourself can really upset you, right? Or has the power to upset you. You get upset, not because of what something said, but because of how you choose to react to it. And I have found that is an incredibly difficult idea to live by, but even if you can implement that a little in your life, I think it goes a long way to helping keep your keel a little more even, especially when you're facing adversity. So there you go. Thanks for letting me talk a little philosophy there to you at the end, but I like this quote here too. "Freedom doesn't mean you get to choose what happens to you, but you do get to choose how you react to it." That's Stephen R. Donaldson from his novel, The One Tree. All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club.
Baz had never heard Rox hesitate like that before, which unsettled him any more than it had a right to. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.